Eric,
Omar.
it happened again.
What's that?
You had another phenomenal duo episode with the other Eric. Is that what we're referring to Helms now? I don't know when he's not present. Do I just call him Helms? Like, what's the situation there?
Most people tend to refer to him as the other Eric, so we can do that.
Okay. Yeah, and that's relevant. I mean, I did read the comments. I thought it was a fantastic episode. Someone said, hey, really appreciate how they dove right into the topic. So that's what we're going to do today. It's all about Erics, particularly Trexler. It's going to be a very interesting episode, as you'll see. Not sure what we'll title it, but you just said something, and I do want your reaction because we do try and interact with the audience, not directly, of course, and not in any meaningful way, but it's more like top-down hierarchy, pyramid-like structure. We read reviews, react to them, and then throw everyone else at that person. Sometimes we'll read the username and say we don't like this person, excommunicate them. But we are dealing now with Trextopia, Trex Nation, so there's a whole new contingent of people inside the Iron Culture Dome. I want to read for you, Trex, this review. Then we're going to get into your research. Then we're going to get into Trex, the person, the practitioner, the lifter, and science communicator, how all those things kind of coalesce together. But let's get started first with that review, because you mentioned something very interesting about Helms and yourself. Okay, so it's 5 stars. I don't even have to... There's no caveats I have to put before that when I say it to you, because 5 stars around here is good enough for us. It's highly recommended, in parenthesis, despite that Eric guy. This person said, and then the guy's username, I should let you know, Trex, is lock that Eric guy up 6969. Okay, so anyways, it's 5-star review, highly recommended despite that Eric guy. Okay. Practical, informed, non-sensational, evidence-based content for the beginner or advanced lifter alike. My gripe, however, is with the Eric guy. The white bodybuilder one. The one with the PhD and obscure references. The man whose bone-dry sarcasm makes my skin ashy and the corner of my lips crack by the time the 26-hour-long podcast finishes. That man should be incarcerated. Omar and the other knowledgeable, hilarious guy are great, though. 26 hours per episode may seem a little verbose, but it works out quite well as I could put it on before I go to sleep at night, and by the time I wake up in the morning, they're just wrapping up their initial banter segment, and I'm ready for my morning mental pump. 5 stars.
It sounds good. I think it's a little hyperbolic. Most episodes come in well under 23 hours, but I think people tend to exaggerate on the internet, especially when they're complaining and simultaneously giving us a terrific rating. So, yeah, par for the course.
What a phenomenal review. Everyone knows who they are talking about. A shout out to lock that Eric guy up 6969.
And hopefully they will, by the way.
Yeah, hopefully. Who's to say, though, in this day and age? And that's why, Trex, we want to give an inside peek, right? We talk about the ivory tower. We talk about research. You are actually, so this is kind of funny, and we're talking about this off air, where you're actually conducting research, where there's a lot of no shade against anyone. Look, I'm a content creator. I'm a YouTube influencer. So I'm not trying to throw any shots here. I'm just recognizing that a lot of people that will say in the research or the research, like the way that they juxtapose themselves and what they're talking about makes it seem like they were in the lab conducting experiments. But Trex, that is exactly what you're actually doing right now. And I want people, because people say science can't be fun, it can't be interesting, it seems so boring, or like this and that, whatever. Can you give a peek at, like, what were you doing today, man? What's going on? Like, you're an actual researcher. What are you up to?
Yeah, well, most days I have a tweed jacket with elbow patches sitting in my office. So I get in, I put that on, and I light my pipe, and I kind of ponder.
Yeah.
And I'll do that for maybe 9 or 10 hours and then call it a day.
Right.
But today was one of those days where you roll up the sleeves. So I had about $30,000 worth of very fancy water that I needed to weigh into individual servings down to the 1,000th of a gram. And so I was just hunched over a very sensitive scale all day. And in spreadsheets and making meticulous notes and praying to God that I didn't spill any of that $30,000 water, because drops matter.
Hey, it's good to know that university, that institution is fiscally responsible, and that you're the one in charge where you are quite aware that water, like how much is it Trex per liter? Like what's it go for around?
It is about $3,000 a liter. Yeah.
It's just a little bit. It's just a little bit of money, right?
Yeah. But it is crazy though, because like, you know, sometimes you'll hand it to like a study participant, and as far as they're concerned, it's water. But as far as you're concerned, it's like literal gold liquefied into a beverage form. And so like the way that they handle it, you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Everyone chill. Like I measured that to 1,000th of a gram. So what we'll do, this is for doubly labeled water, by the way. And what we're trying to do is look at how these two different isotopes basically, you know, how they're cleared from the body over the course of a week. And we have to fit these, you know, really tight regression slopes to them. And I mean, the little tiny details matter. It's a really, really granular set of measurements and estimates that are involved with this method. So like, we don't just give it to you and say, drink it. We give it to you and say, please drink it. And then we take the bottle back and we fill it with regular water and swish it around and put the lid on and swish it around more and say, okay, now drink that. And then they drink that. I say, okay, give me that back. And we do it again. So we'll do like a double rinsing just to make sure that every single 0.001 milligram or milliliter of water is being ingested. So yeah, it's one of those weird things where on a day like today, you are technically doing science, but you're really just measuring on high alert for like 9 hours straight, you know, which is not intellectually very stimulating, not doing a lot of theoretical pondering, but you know, you got to do this stuff, and then you can actually do the work and do the fun thinking and writing.
Now, Trex, I respect what you're doing. You're making a meaningful difference. That is just a little bit of humor because you did share like what you're doing today. But
Yeah.
I do think it's important to give a 3D representation of the person, because we've had Helms on this podcast talk about himself as the coach, the practitioner, the participant, the lifter, and how all these things intersect, right? So like how the research that he's done, the research that he's reviewed, how it informs his critical thinking, and then how he applies it to himself. We've had a little bit of Trexler. Like we have, okay? We found out that Roadhouse was based upon you. You were the
Yep.
cooler, okay? You were the bouncer. We also have the wrestling background. We see that pedigree, that single leg. You best watch yourself when you're around Trex. But also, you've done natural bodybuilding. You are a pro, as I understand. Am I correct, Trex?
That is correct. I did compete as a pro.
Come on now. How many shows did you do?
I got my pro card, and then I said, okay, I want to compete as a pro to say, you know, check it off the bucket list. And I haven't competed since. So I did my pro debut, and that was, so far, that's been enough to scratch the itch for me.
Yeah, but also, Trex, and this is what I mean. I think it's very important to give this context, and then also just the practical components of how you approach your own training or with your coaching with clients. I think it's going to be very informative for all the listeners. But I get back to this, that we see more often than not, a lot of the people that do participate in research, they're very passionate about lifting. Some sort of aspect about lifting, we've thrown shade lovingly at one Dr. Zordos now for his, his endurance-based training. Like he was a former powerlifter, like really into lifting, did like the Bulgarian style as well. Like we bonded, myself and him, over that, because it's a horrendous style of training. If you want to feel bad about yourself, just squat every day to max. But it's very interesting. And I do think, Trex, not that it gives you, in quotations, street credibility, but really because these are all things that largely happened prior to you being a public figure. Many people might not know about it, but also like you've been coaching for a long period of time. These things help shape you into the person you are today. Talk to me just very briefly, and then I do want to talk about how you approach just your lifting in general, or what were some of the big rocks that you overturned personally, or how you've changed just your overview when it comes to, programming for people. There's a lot of different avenues, but let's talk actually about your powerlifting a little bit, because if I remember correctly, I did find it impressive because you're part of the 500-pound club. In Ohio, did you not squat? Was it in the 181 class? Did you not squat 500 pounds? Like, can you talk to me so we know a little bit about the bodybuilding? Can you talk to me about the powerlifting?
Yeah. So the powerlifting, I actually got into it because of bodybuilding. It was probably like 2011, 2012 when if you were a natural bodybuilder, you were a powerlifter by default. Like everyone was doing it. It was going around. And if nothing else, it was a way to stay not bored between bodybuilding seasons, right? You have something to shoot for and, some nice benchmarks to aim for and things like that. So after I did my first ever bodybuilding show in 2011, I immediately kind of shifted over into powerlifting style training in my off season. And so then in 2012, I did my first powerlifting meet. And it is true, you may have heard, I'm sure everyone's heard this, it was going around, but I held the USAPL state squat record in Ohio in whatever the hell category I was in for literally like 2 weeks, I think, until John Downing came and destroyed it. Because
he's a beast. Explain to the audience.
Well, here's the thing, though. There should be an asterisk next to any record if you have competed in a weight class higher than that one. I think it's completely fraudulent that he went down a weight after I set this totally legitimate, pristine record, because that record that he set belongs in the higher weight class, not the one that he came down into. So I think that there's a huge asterisk next to this, and that may be why he's not in the Hall of Fame. I think the voters see it that way as well. But yeah, so I did at that meet. I squatted 500, and that was my big goal for the meet. I was just like obsessed with squatting because I wanted to bring my legs up, and I kind of embraced the old theory that like if you can squat a tremendous amount of weight, you'll probably end up with big legs in the process. So yeah, I just got really obsessed with squatting, and I am one of 7 very low bar ass to grass squatters in the world, which is certainly a way to do it. Not the way I would do it if I could go back, but yeah, I treated my body like a rental, threw that bar as far down the rear deltoid as I could manage, and was picking up quarters off the ground with my butt cheeks, basically.
Trex, hold up, man. I knew this episode, and I feel like there could be follow-up episodes because it's only getting to know you, but I've thought about this before where people say, man, if I could just go back and I've said this, right? That, when I was coming up in lifting, just the amount of information available that's readily available to be digested by the masses, it wasn't nearly as high as it is right now if I could just go back and alter some of these things. But there's some like really, really strong character forming moments and events, such as, I'll just say very quickly, and I want to get back to it, where I remember that I followed the Ed Cohen deadlift program that basically for myself, because I was maxing out, every single week. It was more periodized, linear periodization, very simple, way less volume. Anyways, allowed me to PR, but at the same time, shout out to Sean Kelly, owner of Fortis Fitness. He is Westside certified, not saying that he did the Westside approach 100%, because I know if I was to describe, people say like, well, you did this when you should really do that. Anyways, we're maxing out Trex, maxing out, like weekly max out, but his definition was max out and basically fail. So you work up to your actual number, which is RP 10, 100%, and then you just keep going up until you fail. Then the next movement, which would be a belt squat, we would load that up for a max triple. And again, you do that till you fail. Unsurprisingly, after 16 weeks, everything was, I joined my first strength gym. Everything was blowing up. The deadlift over 100 pounds. Bench press was steadily ticking up, everything. My squat over the 12 or 16 weeks actually remained the same after training the hardest I had trained. But I will say the character form and qualities of that were every single session, the squat session, which was one time a week and then a dynamic day, they were grueling, but in a good way where like you were pushing each other. It was just like a handful of us. But I want to go back to you for a second because you said about yourself, ATG squatting quite low with the low bar, which is something pretty damn surprising because, for most people, when you compete in powerlifting, understandably, you're trying to hit the depth that is necessary in order to be green lit, in order to get the white light, and basically no more, right? Like you don't want to do this extra work. Are you telling me this right now, Trex? Like your depth on your low bar squat, like obviously it's 2 comp standard, but it was like lower than it needed to be?
Oh, dramatically lower. And no, it was legitimately ass to grass. And so then I would, at the powerlifting meet, I would rack the bar. And back then, believe it or not, if you were walking around in the 170s and you were working up to a 500 squat, people thought you were really something there. And so I would have like strangers at that meet come up to me and say, hey, you're putting up like really good numbers, but like, you don't have to do that, right? Like you can cut that squat about halfway compared to where you're going. But that's the thing about me is, first of all, if you've been training that way, then it's not as easy as just saying, oh, if I just cut this rep shorter, I'll throw another 40 pounds on this. It doesn't really work that way. You know, I trained ass to grass, and so that's where I was strongest at that time. And I was getting a nice, good kind of elastic bounce out of the bottom. But the reason that I gravitated toward that in training is kind of it's a characteristic that applies to a lot of things in my life. It's just something that's generally a common theme in my life, which is that I almost never trust my own perception. And so I was the type of person that when I would try to squat to just competition depth, in my brain, I'd be like, oh no, that must have been at least 6 inches high. And then I'd like look at a video and I buried it, like just way deeper than I needed to be. And so for me, it was almost like this, it was just easier to say, well, I'm going to go as low as a person can go, and then I will never get a red light due to depth. But yeah, I've never really trusted my own perception of things. I've always really, really doubted my own observations and experiences and perceptions. And I think ultimately that's why I gravitated toward science in the first place, is because it is so much easier to get an objective sense of the world around you without feeling like there's, you know, as much clouding from your own biased perceptions or viewpoints of something.
Trex, that's very interesting. We're going to dive right into that. I first want to give you respect, however, just because I would say out of the big three, and maybe this is my own bias because I would say my squat, as an example, compared to the deadlift and the bench press, it's fine. Like and I'll say this, if you're squatting ATG in the 170s, weighing in the 170s, 500 pounds, even today, because, you know, the lower you go, definitely the harder it gets, you're going to get respect no matter what. But I think that's like a lifter's choice. You know, you'll see a lot, like I was just at the gym today, as an example. There's a lot of kind of like gym bros that are more, you know, upper body dudes. They'll bench 315 and it's good, but like the entirety of their training kind of facilitates that, right? They have a lot of hypertrophy in the upper body. They'll bench, you know, a pretty high frequency. It's kind of like, that's like the default, like the bro lift, right? Okay. And then the deadlift, there is something like kind of fundamental about it when you're doing it, where some people will just sort of get good at it. And like, because it's starting from a dead stop, like some people will experience like a dramatic, you know, increase in the amount that they're able to lift, if like height, like so on and so forth. Not that their technique goes out the window, but there's multiple different ways to approach a deadlift, conventional or sumo. But with a squat, like you have to put in the time. Like there are some people, Trex, that they'll squat like 4 plates within a few weeks, a few months, and like they're just gifted in that respect. But anyone that works up to a large squat, it basically is a representation of either months or years of work. And it's also the lift that's just not as glamorous to the outside world, right? Like anyone, the bench press, like every bro will ask you how much you bench. The deadlift kind of, it has become a representation to outsiders. Oh, that's like a strength movement, right? And with a squat, like they could see it, but to contextualize like, oh, 500 pounds, what the hell does that mean? So that's the lifter's choice first. So I want to say that's very cool. But I want to ask you this, when you said you did not trust your own observations. So we're now talking about a decade ago, a little bit more than a decade ago. At this point in time, were you already, like, how were you approaching your own training? And I think this is something maybe people will get mistaken, where they'll assume, like, as an example, that the next level that you need in order to get the results that you've been after is, oh, like, you've been training hard. Guess what, Trex? You just got to grind it out more. But it really is like a lot of these large rocks. For me, as a very basic example, over a decade ago, I was maxing out on the deadlift, triples every single week. As soon as I started keeping some reps in reserve and I started periodizing the way that I approached it, my deadlift experience, I was not as beat up. I was more fresh. I was able to produce a better result week to week. It had a dramatic impact on how strong I got. But I'm wondering at this point, and then we'll kind of walk it through, like you becoming like a pro bodybuilder and then you being a coach. What were some of the like big rocks that you're overturning? What were you learning about yourself? You said like you're skeptical about your own ability to observe like the world, yourself, your lift, your performance. So like, were you turning to coaches, reading resources? Were you already getting into kind of like exercise science content? What's going on, man?
Yeah, so at that time I was just getting into studying exercise science, I hadn't really learned enough to really apply it to what I was doing at that time, at least not in terms of like formal academic learning. So what I was doing was trying to learn from other people. And this was back in the heyday when the bodybuilding.com forums were really where it was at.
Yeah.
And so I would see, what kind of tried and true established programs do other people seem to be advocating for in large numbers. And of course, that's still an imperfect, set of observations compared to, totally objective research. But as someone who wasn't yet fully into research at the time, it was close enough where I could say, okay, I feel like I can delude myself into feeling like I'm making great progress or terrible progress or something in between. I'd like to at least be able to use the observations of others as a guide so that I can try out some other things and see how they go. So that's kind of how I was approaching it. I was I think I was honestly too stubborn to work with a coach at the time. I really wanted to be able to control every little element of my training, and handing that over to someone I think would have made me, I just don't think I would have enjoyed it as much. You know what I mean? So I didn't work with a coach yet at that time, but I just really enjoyed kind of keeping an ear to the ground and seeing what people were doing and how they were liking it, and then trying those things and seeing how they go for me.
Trex, I love it. I mean, I'm gonna give you some hot questions because we're just getting right into.
Yeah.
Was it a bad era or the best era? By the way, we're gonna call this. We're not gonna get a lawsuit. You said the bodybuilding.com forum. I feel like we should call these episodes featuring Trex just like T-Nation, right? Just call like Trexler Nation, right? Just
Yeah.
It's all about Trex.
It's a little bit disappointing because I never got into the T-Nation side of things. Like, I know for a lot of people of my age, T-Nation articles formed like the foundation of their lifting experience and personality. And on both accounts, I'm glad to say I kind of skipped over that trend. The T-Nation stuff never really resonated with me. I didn't even really know about it because I was just kind of siloed away in other corners of, online fitness. But it was a good time, honestly. I think that was back in the day when I think there were a lot of fruitful conversations happening in forums and on Facebook at the time. And I think social media at that stage of the game, specifically for lifting, was it really kind of served that idealized purpose of being a forum of ideas and open discussion. And there were people that I made very strong bonds with and would kind of keep in touch with. And so I think that was it was really cool because I think gym culture itself has kind of, it's maybe deteriorated a little bit. And of course it's going to differ from gym to gym, but it seems to me, painting with a tremendously broad brush, that there's a little bit less camaraderie in a lot of gym settings, particularly like the big chain commercial gyms. And I think that for a lot of people, the forums at that time kind of filled that kind of niche when gyms were starting to make that turn, if that makes sense, where people were like, okay, I don't walk into my gym and it's not like, the Arnold days where everybody's chilling and they're doing their 3-hour workouts. And it's, there wasn't really that culture. And it felt like, okay, well, we can kind of manufacture that. Yeah, we all go train at our own gyms, but we're in here comparing notes, keeping up with each other's training and stuff. So, I think it was a really good time for online fitness, and it was more about exchanging ideas and kind of pushing each other. I mean, I'll be totally candid. When I squatted 500, I told you that was a big goal of mine. It was because me and some other dude on the forum were racing to 500, and I do think that kind of lit a fire under me and kind of pushed me through some of those more arduous workouts where I otherwise might have said, what's the rush? Who cares? So it was a very good, productive time. Yeah, it wasn't perfect. Nothing on the internet ever is, but I think it was less about whatever is happening. It was less of a popularity thing, less of trying to I mean, at that time, no one really was thinking about like, I need to generate a following for myself, or at least I certainly wasn't. And so I think the interactions were just a little bit more genuine and a little bit more about embracing the iron game, more so than kind of, you know, building something big or generating, some kind of revenue stream for yourself.
Trex, if you just join my email list, man, I'm going to give you
Yeah.
5 tips in order to blow up your squat. No, but so this is the hot take. Now, of course, hindsight is 2020. And I do like semi-fondly look back on that era of natural bodybuilders that basically would do a power building kind of approach, or let's say the big 3 being at the forefront of how they would approach their off season. Now, there's so many different factors at play. But I want you just to reflect back on that for a second. Like, of course, you could, very surgically take a look at it and say, like, was that the optimal way to approach hypertrophy? But then you have to think about those other factors, such as like one's enjoyment, to the point like you just did like a bodybuilding prep, and like now you're looking for another way to kind of put all your focus and attention in some sort of meaningful way where you'll derive, enjoyment in the gym, and then your ability to apply yourself in the gym might be higher doing that style of training versus another style of training you're just not as enthused. But can you look back now over a decade later, let's say, where things have become not more fractured, there's a wider variety perhaps of approaches, but at that time, like we're talking about 2010, Trex, 11, 12, 13, where there really was a strong intersection between like natural bodybuilding, meaning people actively getting ready to compete in bodybuilding, like actually compete. So not just like, like natural lifters who do a little bit of hypertrophy training, and then having off seasons where they'd focus on getting those numbers up. And it was generally thought that, if you get your squat up, like your legs are also going to increase and so on and so forth. Can you reflect back a little bit about that time? Not like, oh, like here's a critique going, of course it's not optimal, you want to get hypertrophy, but just maybe like the culture that was around, and like some things you learned either about yourself or like, wouldn't do that again. Or like, you know what, maybe that's an aspect that's missing. Just like an honest reflection.
Yeah, I think it was good for it was good for developing experience as a lifter and kind of expanding your knowledge base as a lifter, because I think if my only goal was to be the best bodybuilder I could, then I do think you could go back and say, yeah, you probably don't need to do all these extended periods of like, really focused powerlifting training. There's probably more time-efficient ways to structure your training, things that you can recover from a little better than, some of your really intense powerlifting blocks. So, physiologically, maybe it wasn't optimal, but from a environmental or psychological or social standpoint, there was something really cool about being part of a big group of folks who were doing the same stuff, so that was a really positive, motivating factor. And then, like I said, learning more about lifting, like when you push to that extreme of the training spectrum and try to really focus in on building your 1 rep maxes, you learn some things that you might not have otherwise learned if you just stayed within the traditional bodybuilding workouts. I mean, when I first started getting into lifting, at first I was just doing whatever I could, I'd go ride the circuit of hammer strength machines at my gym when I was 12, right? And say, oh, okay, I see what they're getting at with this one. I'll push on it as hard as I can. But my first real like deep dive into training was when I was starting to get really intense into wrestling. And one of the assistant coaches on my team really took an interest in my development. He was like, hey, this guy's got some potential more so as a lifter than a wrestler. And this assistant coach was super into lifting, and he really took me under his wing. And when the team was doing one workout, he'd say, forget that. We're going to go do this thing. And so he was my training partner. And we would kind of deviate from what the team was doing. And a lot of our workouts that we would do, depending on the time of year, sometimes they'd literally be straight out of Muscle and Fitness magazine. I mean, literally, it was like me, my coach, and Jim Stepani, clanging and banging. And but man, that coach was a great guy. He invested so much into my development and was super supportive and really kind of lit that lit that fire in me. And yeah, I felt super betrayed though. So here's a little funny story. My senior year, I think I ended up wrestling 145 very comfortably because I was out most of the year with injury, and it was a series of concussions. I don't know if the science has changed at this point, or if we've learned more, I should say. But at that time, because I had so many concussions in such a small period of time, they didn't even want me to exercise. They didn't want my blood pressure to go up and, blood flow to the brain and all that. So they wanted me to just chill. So I basically was just like out of shape and kind of flabby, and just like by the time the postseason came around, they were like, okay, you can go back there and give it your best. But yeah, like that season, I probably could have wrestled 135 and definitely could have wrestled 140, no problem. So I ended up bumping up into 145, 152. These are in pounds, obviously. But anyway, I go off to my first year of college after that season, and I'm like, dude, I'm going to get so beefy. And when I come back, this coach is going to see, how much I've taken where we started and just ran with it. He is going to be in awe of the mass that I've cultivated. So I leave at like 145 pounds. Less than a calendar year later, I'm coming back in like the 190s, and I'm just beefed up. And I'm like, and it was crazy because it's like, when you come back to the wrestling room, and we go back, and we had a great wrestling culture in our program. We had a really successful team. Coaches were great. The kids were great. And the people who graduate would still come back and get back into the gym and lift weights and wrestle. And, because it's always good to have more guys in the room that can challenge each other. But I had got to the point, by the time I came back, I was wrestling a whole different group of guys because I jumped up like 6 weight classes, But anyway, I come back.
How are you doing?
What's that?
How are you doing at those heavier weight classes?
Really well, because
then that's good weight.
Well, it was a mix, but my style of wrestling was really conducive. If you go to a wrestling meet, not that I condone it, it's because if you don't get the sport, you're going to be bored to tears. But when you go to, like, for example, a high school or college wrestling meet, the style of wrestling that's happening in the lower weight classes looks fundamentally different than what you see in the higher weight classes. The bodies move differently. And for whatever reason, my style of wrestling was really more conducive to being a heavier wrestler. So it was interesting to see how it actually translated super well. And I was like, I should have gained these 50 pounds a year ago. Would have served me well. But anyway, so I come back, and I'm excited to see the pride and admiration of this coach who got me into lifting. And this dude looks like he lost about 30 pounds of muscle. And I'm like, what happened? He's like, oh, you're still lifting? Nah, we're past that. I'm a marathoner now. And I felt so betrayed, man. But like, this guy was so good at everything, like great wrestler, great lifter. He just on a whim was like, yeah, we're getting into marathons now. And just instantly was like crushing it at the Boston Marathon, like running way under 3 hours. I love that guy and also hated that guy because just whatever he wanted to do athletically, just say it, it's done. Like he was insane. But anyway, so back in the day, like I said, if I would have just stuck with that general paradigm, basically mimicking what I see in the Muscle and Fitness, is that what it was called with Jim Stoppani? Muscle and Fitness magazines. I wouldn't have learned as much, and when I got into the powerlifting style training and really dedicated to it for a while, I think it really just kind of expanded and kind of broadened my perspective on lifting. And later when I would get into coaching, that was super helpful, because powerlifting, there's a different kind of fatigue. You know what I mean? When you just feel drained because you've had a ton of weight on your back and you've been doing it day in and day out. The kind of just different level of soreness and stiffness that you can run into in those really intense training blocks. And even just like, I found things about my body that I probably never would have observed if I just stuck with pure bodybuilding training or only read research on the topic. So for example, for whatever reason, my pecs grow like crazy specifically when I'm doing a lot of flat benching. Incline benching just doesn't really do it for me. Neither does decline. Flat or just the slightest incline is really where the sweet spot is for me. And also when I do heavier kind of lower rep, a lot of like just lower rep heavy benching seems to just make my upper body explode, especially my pecs, obviously. So, you know, I would learn some of these weird little things where I'm like, okay, I can look back and make sense of it through the literature, but I don't think I would have had a finding like that jump out and kind of slap me in the face from the pages of the research. So I don't know, when you experiment with different types of training, you start to see how your body responds to dramatically different styles of training. And I think that it really helps you understand, you know, especially down the road, if you're going to train someone else, you know, what can we expect from their response from a given type of program, you know, and how to kind of leverage these different tools that you get from bodybuilding training or powerlifting training. How do you mix and match and kind of make those work for a program based on a person's goals?
We're getting right into the meat, Trex. I'm loving this, man. Monster episode. Fire the signal. The flare gun has been hit. So a few things. One, love the heavier weight class. Always love the wrestling conversations. I unironically, like I've been into MMA for quite some time, like now well over 15 years. In Canada here, we don't have, you know, as rigorous wrestling program. So that's a little bit disappointing. I think I would have done something like Sambo if it was available. But unironically, Trex, just complete side note, I've gotten into sumo wrestling in the last like 6 to 8 months. I respect like the cultural tradition,
cool.
the form, like the whole idea. It's like wrestling, but no knee, like any body part, like knee, hand touches the ground, you're out. And the Mongolians, man, they've been a few different. There's like a Hawaiian guy, Akibono, that just passed away. There's the first like non-Japanese born person to become a Yokozuna. But anyways, like the Mongolians, because they have their own style of wrestling that's very conducive towards like becoming a sumo wrestler. But all that to say that I think it's very interesting where you have these intersections between you doing wrestling, then through wrestling, finding lifting, then the betrayal of said coach, you know, like becoming a marathon runner, but how it's like, it's a messy, wonderful process. I think it's kind of cool, like looking at someone such as yourself that is, you know, at the forefront when it comes to communicating like exercise science, like your journey though, and like how some of these things help shape you, like both as a person, like your perspective. But there's a few things just to touch on there, and then I want to continue along the journey. The first is that for me, a personal revelation that I had as soon as I finally actually started doing, let's say, like more powerlifting style training, is versus being just a gym bro. A gym bro's day to day or week to week is fairly homogenous, right? Like when you have chest on Monday, like you're gonna work up to a set of 8. Like usually, like I'm making generalizations here, but you're gonna work up to your set. And basically your idea is just to do more, right? Like squeeze out a few more reps, lift a little bit more weight. Like it's basically going to be a very similar routine week to week. Whereas powerlifting, the temporal aspect where it's like, okay, well now it's periodized. So like this is week 1 and this is how many reps you're going to do. This is going to be the load you're going to use and so on and so forth, where like your approach in theory has to be a little bit more methodical. And that to me personally started playing out. I already was interested always in learning more, getting it right. And it was more from like a practical standpoint of how do I utilize this information, quite frankly, to get like better results. Like honestly, this is for myself, for my clients. But I would say powerlifting opened a prism for me in terms of how I approach the whole structure as it relates to lifting and not just like, once again, pre-powerlifting. And I brought up that deadlift example where I would do deadlifts, but I'd basically do the same thing week to week because the whole idea, well, you just got to keep training hard, right? You got to keep like, you know, how do you think you're going to lift more weight if you're not lifting more weight, right? Like just like very rudimentary like conversations. So
did you find that it also kind of changed your perspective for how you approach individual workouts?
Sure.
I know for me, it totally did. Like for me, when I switched from being a bodybuilder or a gym bro to like, I'm powerlifting now to do a meet and all that stuff. I started going into like subconsciously going into workouts the way I went into workouts back when I was an athlete. Whereas like my job is actually to bring my best into the gym today, you know, It's not just like, oh, I'm going to do bicep curls until I can't anymore, and whatever I get, I get. It's like, no, I got stuff on the spreadsheet that has to get done. And if that ends up being an RPE 10 instead of an RPE 8, I don't really like how that's going to have ripple effects maybe for tomorrow's workout. Like, I started to really feel like an athlete again, where it was like, yeah, maybe I should go to bed earlier because I have a workout to, like, like it was these little things of like, maybe I shouldn't have another beer. Maybe I should go to bed earlier. Maybe I should, watch my diet a little bit so that I can feel really recovered. And to me, that was a big eye-opening kind of thing.
Trex, we're going to get back to you, man. But you just opened a portal, because I could say 1,000%. And one of the things that I thoroughly enjoy about lifting is a little bit of that structure of feeling in quotations, like an athlete, where the idea that everything that I do in this particular workout will influence what happens after it. So like there's a sequential additive effect of what I'm choosing to do. And then there's a theoretical payoff at the end. And for me, part of the juice of lifting, quite frankly, is that adrenaline rush, or that idea there's a performance at a particular point, not necessarily at a meet, but even it's sufficient for me just to hit a PR. But I know everything I do, and I have to become, I subconsciously, to your exact point, like right now. So I hit recently like that 610 deadlift thing. Training has been going, thankfully, very, very well. Like just like overall life stress and so forth has sort of balanced out. So I'm applying myself, but like Trex, like before I go to bed, like not that any of these things sound crazy, but I will so when I'm doing hypertrophy training, and people in the comments, they could absolutely correct me. And yes, it changes. And like, yes, if you want to maximize hypertrophy, you do have to, I'd say, have a relatively similar approach where like, okay, so I did 265 for 10. Like I do want to beat that at some point, but like there's a more definite structure I would still put when it comes to powerlifting. We're like tomorrow, Trex. All right, I'm doing 220 kgs on the deadlift for a triple. How to look next week? And for me, honestly, to help me fall asleep these days, I'll get back to what I thought about before, which is I'll just start visualizing like some of the workouts, or like how the previous weeks have gone, or what I need to do. And I will make choices that are better overall, I would say, for my health writ large, like in terms of nutritional choices and everything else, when I have that structure. So it's something, yes, man, I 100% appreciate. And that's why I think, even though I'm in a bit of a hypertrophy block right now, where I'm gaining quality tissue, like I'm finally doing a bulk, I'm leaving like the 83 kg kind of class, I'm still keeping some aspects of powerlifting, like the deadlift in particular, where it just gives me that edge where I really, you like what you like, you apply parts of yourself of things that you are very emotionally invested in, and it gives me that little extra edge that I really enjoy. So no, that's, man, what a fantastic comment. I want to move on with kind of your training and so forth, but
sure.
I 1,000% agree, man.
Yeah. So what are we moving on to with my training?
Yeah. So ATG, that booty's picking up quarters. Okay. You're just squatting it down. And now what's the evolution for you? Like what happened? So you did some of that powerlifting stuff. You want to do, bodybuilding. Like what's happening? Are you starting to coach people? Like at what point did you have to really start? I think the question I want to ask, at what point did you have to start thinking about the different components as it relates to training? Maybe even it could have happened with yourself, just you personally, where you're like, all right, like, let me take a look, a retrospective on what I've been doing, what has been working, hasn't been working. When did you become a little bit more methodical, either for yourself or maybe, I don't know if you're coaching people at the time, like when did you start shifting it towards becoming a little bit more analytical with your training? Not that you weren't necessarily before, but yeah.
Yeah, I do think powerlifting, getting into that and specifically preparing for a meet was where I started to get really methodical with training. Not based on anything, not based on scientific evidence, but just based on like, here's a set program. It's, Shiko, whatever, or small law, or, here's a set program, and there's got to be some kind of structure to it that makes sense. There's some elements of periodization. I think powerlifting got me into that because it's just part of the game, and then I carry that forward a little bit with bodybuilding, but ultimately, a lot of the times where it came to like, forks in the road with training, and when I decided to push more for this instead of that, a lot of it was due to circumstance. Like, I did my first bodybuilding competition in 2011, and I knew I needed to take some time to actually improve before I competed in bodybuilding again. So like the intuitive choice was like, all right, let's focus a little more on some powerlifting or power building, just to kind of keep things interesting. Did that first meet, and actually like really shortly after ran into kind of a nasty injury. And so then I was like, well, I mean, it wasn't that nasty, but in the grand scheme of things, but it was enough to kind of say, okay, maybe focus on hypertrophy while that heals up. And, I kind of would just kind of oscillate based on, I'm kind of sick of my hypertrophy training. It's getting kind of stale. Maybe I'll focus more on strength, but I've always kind of gone with the flow on that, and kind of, I've tried to zoom out and look at the bigger picture and say like, even if there's a little bit of oscillation back and forth when you run into friction on one side or the other, as long as they're both kind of in a general upward trajectory, you can kind of zoom out and piece it together in a way that makes sense analytically, right? So you say, okay, yeah, for these however many months, we're focused on building up some muscularity. That got kind of scale. Now we shifted over to strength. So I don't know. I've always, I will say that powerlifting really opened my eyes to like, wow, like if you actually have some structure to this, things kind of fall into place in, a little bit more predictably. But I carried that with me in spirit, but yeah, I've kind of got to the point where, I was going with the flow for a while. And then at a certain point, I think it became clear to me that I just had more aptitude for bodybuilding than powerlifting. And that's when I started to get a little bit more analytical about specifically how I approach my bodybuilding. And that's when I started to draw more on the scientific literature. And I'd say, and it just so happened to coincide temporally with my academic development, right? So by the time it was becoming clear to me that I was a better bodybuilder than powerlifter, or, the more I did powerlifting, I just kind of would notice that I didn't feel as good. I didn't really like being all beat up all the time with the way I was training. And I was like, I just think bodybuilding's a better fit for me. And at that point, I was starting to get into more research, and I felt equipped to kind of start digging into, okay, well, if I want to do this bodybuilding stuff really analytically, how many days a week would I train? What kind of training split would I do? What kind of rep ranges would I want to really focus on? And, it was kind of lucky that coincided with the kind of, I don't know, kind of the beginning of this modern wave of very applied lifting research. Like back around 2000, between like 2010 and 2015, we get a lot of those like classic meta-analyses and original studies where for the first time, people were starting to look into like really practical stuff out of the muscle magazines. What's up with supersets? What's up with drop sets? Full body splits versus bro splits. Like we're starting to see some of these kind of really applied research topics find their 3 sets versus 1 set. Those things were kind of starting to hit the literature right when I was starting to get into the literature. And of course, that's not a coincidence. You hear about a couple big headline studies and go, wait, there's research on this stuff? And so that's really when that transition occurred, I think. And it was really interesting to see how lifting kind of got me into research. And then at a certain point, I really feel like, I got into lifting because I wanted to get good at football. And then I found that I actually liked lifting more than football. And I got into science because I liked lifting. And I do wonder if I'm at a point where maybe, if I'm being completely honest, I might enjoy science more than I enjoy lifting, which is something I never would have expected. But it very, very much might be the case.
No, Trex, look, Helms is not here. Helms is my guy. I was curious about that, what you just said, because for him, and I think this is so cool, once again, like both of you, a great example, where part of the reason why he decided to get into research, like pursue his education, is he wanted to be a better lifter. You know what I mean? Where he's like his master's, right? On protein, his PhD on RP, right? Like these things are very practical in terms of what a lifter needs to do and how they need to potentially utilize it. So I think that is completely fair for you to say that, like now, especially at this stage, like you find the science aspect more interesting than the lifting. How then did you start incorporating, as you got further down the rabbit hole, into either your own journey, like you brought up? I'll just give you an example. I'm sure you have a ton. Like, was that just a natural, tendency for you to, when you cut, like where you don't have to worry about things, where you don't have to change it? What you said, like I think you described this is over a year old, this podcast for sure at this point. What you were saying for yourself, like when you're getting ready as a natural bodybuilder, was it that you learned all these like requisite skills from just doing it time and time again, where it came time to lose weight, really get shredded? Not that it wasn't difficult, but you'd done it so many times where it wasn't as hard as you thought it was, or what, were they tricks that you learned when it comes to the research? Like, what is that something where there's a connection whatsoever? Or no, it's other aspects for yourself? Because I did find that notable, only because I do say, Trex, like most people have not gotten into natural bodybuilding shape. I've heard from many, natural bodybuilders at some point, like it just starts sucking some way. Is this just like a Zen mindset that Trexler has? Is it something he learned along the way from coaching, from training, from lifting, from research? Like what's going on here?
Yeah, I think when it comes to like what enables that, getting into that type of shape, I don't think it's having like an encyclopedic knowledge of physiology literature. When I first got into it, I did believe that would be the case. I was like, oh, I bet if I get really deep into the weeds on this literature, I will kind of crack open some secret codes in terms of how to make this happen and how to do it the right way. And I think the literature really comes into play for two main applications. Number one is just kind of cross-referencing your experience with the experience of others. Like, is this weird that I feel so shitty? And then you look at the literature and say, oh no, this is totally normal. Nothing to see here. And another area where it can be helpful is just kind of building up, like the Batman utility belt, just adding more tools to it and feeling like, okay, even if I don't use all these different strategies, it's good to know what's out there in terms of dieting strategies, when they might come in handy. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the research for dieting is that it doesn't necessarily tell you the best way to do it, but it does tell you the very many viable ways to do it. And I think that is really what unlocked kind of a next level of success for me as a bodybuilder, was when I realized, like, what if optimization isn't necessarily the goal, because there's 5 different roads I could take that all eventually lead to the same place. And most of what we might consider optimization might just be like, hey, how important is it for you to get there in 22 weeks instead of 25? And the answer is, I don't care at all. Like, if you're telling me like, hey, there's 4 different routes you could take, one of which totally suits your tendencies, your psychology, your preferences, your schedule. The only downside is you're going to have to start 3.5 weeks earlier. Who cares? I'm going to be doing this for 5 or 6 months anyway, right? So I think for me, yeah, the research really came into it in terms of helping me understand that it's not necessarily about finding the best way. It's about finding your preferred way that is still just as good as the rest. Because I think that's really more what it looks like, is that there are several viable ways to do this. You just have to go with one of them. And the research kind of enabled me to have confidence in the idea that, well, everyone's doing it this way, but I'm pretty sure you should be able to succeed just as well doing it that way. And that's kind of the approach that I ended up gravitating toward it. And more specifically, like, just because I'm sure people haven't heard exactly how I dieted the last time I did a bodybuilding competition, but it was like 2017, the last time I competed. And it's become a much more normal thing nowadays. But in 2017, I was like, I don't really feel like tracking my food. Like, it's kind of a pain in the butt. And then when I do it and I'm like looking at these numbers all day, it's just kind of like, I have to get pretty low, and my calories get pretty low when I'm dieting relative to even the typical lifter my size. So I just found that I was psychologically more inclined to just dwell on it and kind of, think about the calories I wasn't having all day. I was like, forget that. I'm just going to put together a decent, well-rounded diet and just stick with it day in and day out. And if weight loss starts to slow down, what do you think I should do? Probably eat less, right? So, and usually it wasn't necessarily eating less, it was just making a food swap, right? Yeah. So potatoes becomes carrots and cauliflower, right? Just easy little swaps where your plate still looks just as full as it used to, but instead of chicken thighs, it's chicken breast. And instead of, You're just making these little swaps and substitutions and maybe taking the foot off the gas when it comes to oil that you might be adding to a meal. And so, yeah, my approach to bodybuilding dieting eventually became extremely simplified and was just kind of making basic food swaps and substitutions, trying to keep my overall food volume fairly stable and really just try not to sweat the small stuff. And I even got to a point, I know Helm's still, I watch Helms die inside when I say this, but he's not here, so I'll say it liberally. I don't even peak. Like, I've tried and I don't like, maybe I'm just the only idiot in the world who can't peak well, but like after doing a handful of shows, I found that the ones where I didn't really try to peak, I look great. The ones where I tried to peak, I look slightly worse. And I was like, forget it. I know what I look like every day. Things are going fine. And I mean, yeah, I got to the point where I just really simplified everything. And like, if we're being totally honest, for most bodybuilding shows, like, you're probably not one peak away from jumping from fourth to first, unless it's like, you know, highly, highly, highly competitive world stage. Everybody's excellent. You know, if you're doing like your typical local show, even if it's kind of like a lower level pro show, the placings usually aren't even like razor thin close enough where you're a peak away from really jumping to a totally different spot in the placing. So yeah, I think research and being more analytical about my approach kind of opened up a lot of windows or a lot of doors where I took a simplified approach. I reduced my meal frequency more than most people would, you know, so I got to the point where I was kind of basically doing like a time-restricted feeding approach. And yeah, research really came in handy for that, of saying like, well, okay, you could do this instead of that. You could do food swaps instead of tracking. You could do time-restricted feeding instead of eating, you know, 6 meals a day like everybody else. And that stuff really, really came in handy.
No, you know, Trex. That makes complete sense. Helms is currently listening to this as it's being released, dying on the inside. I have to put on my Helms hat, not to try and defend
like,
it, but
I want to be clear, because I know that I'm going to get a lot of flack for that from people privately. I do not dispute the merits of peaking for a bodybuilding show. I just know for me personally, the risk reward was not in my favor. I tended to look best when I just didn't mess things up. And so that's what I gravitated toward.
Trex, I got to put on the Helms hat, and then I'm going to move on because you said a lot of great stuff. He would say, well, Trex, you just mentioned prior about an hour ago that you don't really trust your own observations about yourself. So could this be a situation where you're not aware that the peak might be working for you?
You raise a good point. Should I give the credit to you or Helms?
Helms. I was embodying
Helms raises a good point there.
Yeah.
We'll have to give him credit for being on this episode now.
Yeah.
In the moment, I couldn't tell.
Yeah.
Like in the moment, you know, when I had like shows that were back. And the only reason I found this out was because 2 different times, 2 different competitive cycles, you know, competitive seasons, I did a show I didn't care about and didn't bother peaking for it. And then I did the show I did care about either 1 or 2 weeks after. And after I have 4 sets of pictures, like the day of the shows, I couldn't give myself an honest assessment of, oh, do I look better than a week ago or not? Yeah. But after having 4 sets of pictures, it was the pictures that convinced me, like, oh, damn. Yeah, like I'm clearly, you know, when I just, the thing that really convinced me was not that I looked at those pictures and said, wow, I just suck at peaking and I did it way wrong. I looked at the pictures and I said, this first set of pictures, in both cases where I didn't do anything out of the norm, I am happy with the fullness and the leanness. And like, there was nothing I would have wanted to peak in order to change or modify. So it's not that I looked flat as hell at the beginning, and then in the second set of pictures, I looked watery and bloated and botched it. It's that when I looked at the first one, I said, why would I do something to try to change this? And then I look at the second and say, God, why did you do that of all things, you know? So yeah, and I think ultimately, you know, I could get into a whole bunch of you know, philosophical elements of like why I think peaking very conservatively usually is optimal. But like, let me just put it this way, Omar. you're a natural bodybuilder competing at 144 pounds. How many hundreds of grams of glycogen do you think you're going to be able to put into this body? You know, like the average human being has, 400 grams of glycogen in their muscle tissue at any given time. And yeah, when people tell me like, yeah, over the course of my peak week, I'm going to increase my carbs by, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of grams of glycogen. My question is, where are they going? Because you're not at zero when you start.
Right.
You kind of adapt to
I'm negative. I'm actually negative.
Yeah, but you kind of adapt to being in this low glycogen state. You don't go down to zero. Like even people who have been on keto for months and months and months, their muscle glycogen isn't zero. It's depleted, but we know that you still got plenty kicking around in there. So yeah, I think for me, the mathematics, it seems a little off when people say, oh yeah, over the course of the next week, you need to, somehow find a place to put these 2,000 grams of carbohydrate. And I'm like, where? How does that work? But anyway, beside the point.
I found that very interesting what you said about potentially incorporating, nuggets of research into how you approach your lifting or your prep. I was thinking like as an example, like when it comes to like, I don't know, like reds, like this, that, like the length of the prep that you do, or even I'll give you an example. Then maybe one of the like questions to like bring it full circle now to a contemporary context. For myself, Trex, to the point where your own experiences, how they can be unique. So in 2019, where I was doing some powerlifting and then I decided to get leaner, and I decided at the time there's some research surrounding like diet breaks. And for myself, even though there's been more research showing, like, is it more effective to do a diet break than straight dieting? Doesn't seem to be the case. Okay. But when, you are the person experiencing it, the thing I consistently would go through, because I always had my numbers in mind, if I had to lose more than like 5% of my body weight, which I did this time, at some point there would be a degradation in performance when it came to lifting. And for myself, that time in 2019, where it's something like a 3-on-1 off or whatever, like 3-on-1, like a pretty strong maintenance. So we bump up the calories. And Trex, like, so as an example where, you can measure like the performance, and on average, like people, it doesn't seem to affect their performance. For me, I would say subjectively, having that week off where I timed then when I'm periodizing my powerlifting style training, well, normally I would be pushing it into pushing hard while I'm dieting. But then on the final week, it would be either, whatever, like a deload. And then I would peak for like the 4-week block or whatever when I'm on my refeed for that week. And it seemed like at that time, I felt a lot better. My performance, I didn't feel as flat or like just, tired where the amount of work that I was doing. And again, not that didn't relate to any of the research that's coming out at the time, but just the idea, to your point, I really like what you said about like 5 viable paths. Were something I had never tried before, because in my mind, Trex, I was like, oh man, yeah, like whatever. If I'm going to do for 12 weeks, well, this approach I'm actually going to do for 15 or 16 weeks. That's like, that's 20% more, that's 30% more total time. Like, why would I just do that? And so I think just having that avenue open to explore, even if it may or may not have worked out, was something that I found, important and insightful to myself.
Yeah, and that's a great example, because I do remember back in the day, in some of my earlier research, I was really, really open to the idea of refeeds and diet breaks, and some might even say I was a proponent of them. And reverse dieting, I'm pretty sure I'm the first person that mentioned it in a peer-reviewed paper. Not that is a credential worth that I don't have a plaque for it or a certificate anywhere. But there are these different theories that I was like, oh yeah, this could be cool and this could work and this could be. But in my own personal dieting, I didn't do any of it. I didn't do reverse dieting, and I didn't do refeeds really, and I didn't do diet breaks. And as the literature grew, I became less convinced of reverse dieting as a viable option. Or it was viable, but I saw few use cases for it, very few. But refeeds and diet breaks, I was still kind of advocating for certain applications, and people would be like, well, then how do you use them? I'd be like, oh, I don't touch the stuff. And they're like, why? I'm like, I don't like it. So it's that kind of thing where as a researcher, I can be interested in identifying what are the pros and cons of using these different strategies, and in which applications would they be advisable? But then when it comes to being a coach or a person who's actually doing the thing, I can say, okay, I know that these are viable options, but that doesn't mean I have to take them, because I know that there are other paths I can take with similar effectiveness that might just suit my preferences better.
Trex, there are honestly so many different paths we could go down for this conversation. But I think if we're going by like timeline, where it's like, we kind of started in 2011 and then we worked like 2015, 2017 prep. Let me ask you this maybe as a good final conversation point. Is there anything then in the last like 3 to 4 years? So let's say, I don't know, like for everyone, it's kind of a good demarcation, like the pandemic since like 2020 or whatnot. Research has come out, because you brought up great examples from 2010 to 2015, like research as it relates to anything from supersets, like RPE. There's a lot of like foundational groundwork being laid, meta-analysis, so on and so forth. Is there anything in the last like several years, 3 to 4 years for yourself, where they've lit up kind of like, aha moments in terms of how you'd approach things for clients, or like if someone, if you're to coach them, or even like your own viewer stance as it relates to any aspect of training and nutrition, or just because you've been like, so as an example, like, every single coach is trying to always increase their knowledge, but there's some theoretical point where you've been doing it for such a long period of time and you have like a really good grasp of things. It's not like as a powerlifting coach, like 10 years from now, someone approaches you like, guys, singles, we're all wrong about, like, let's just not do them. I don't think there's going to be like revolutions, but out of curiosity, now that you've been doing this for so long, mass research review at such a high level, is there anything for yourself where you're like, like that is genuinely kind of interesting, like maybe I'll change a little bit the way I approach things? Like I said, more specifically last 3 to 4 years, or has it just been like a more like a smaller refinement of things?
Yeah, I think I could kind of answer this by putting things in 2 different bins. The one bin is like, in the last few years, what area of research is it clear that there are things that I don't know that nobody knows?
Okay.
And then the second bin is, what are the things that I don't know yet that other people know and I just haven't gotten to them, right? So one of the reasons that I went back into research is because I got this incredible opportunity to work with Herman Poncer at Duke, who does what I would consider the most innovative and kind of mind-blowing metabolism research that's being done. And if you've been a reader of the Mass Research Review, you know that I'm not making that up. I've been writing about this line of research for the last 3 or 4 years. In terms of, my research career started with a heavy focus on metabolic adaptation to dietary restriction. And we were kind of putting a picture together, and that literature has changed a lot in the last 3 or 4 years. We've gotten a much clearer picture, but it also kind of felt like we were missing, like, it's hard to explain, but it felt like there was something that we just weren't getting, some important variable in this equation, but you can't really tell what it is. And the research that I'm kind of moving into now, with not energy compensation in response to caloric restriction, but energy compensation in response to exercise and physical activity. I think in the last 3 or 4 years, it's become clear to me that there are questions to be answered there. And even just acknowledging what those questions are has been really eye-opening. It's a kind of revelatory, so to speak, where you say, oh my God, I clearly have been misunderstanding this. Now, in this particular bin of questions, I still don't know exactly what the answer is or the proper way to apply it. But I think in the last 3 or 4 years, I have had that kind of moment where I said, okay, at least I know what the question is, right? And so there's this whole kind of list of questions about how exercise and physical activity, how those responses in terms of metabolism factor into the bigger picture of weight regulation. But then in the other bin, the kind of stuff that has been known that I just haven't really gotten around to, like you said, when you kind of dig into a particular area of research, after a while, you feel like you've pretty much, uncovered most of the rocks in that area, and then there's going to just be incremental findings from there. In the last 3 or 4 years, I've dug really deeply into the I would say that the research related to kind of behavior change, goal setting, some of the psychological elements that people wrestle with as they pursue fitness goals, and then also just some like more practical tools or strategies related to dieting. So, different kinds of ways to make dieting a little bit easier for someone who struggles with it. Ways to identify better goals, or ways to kind of view your approach to those goals and psychologically create an environment that's a little bit more conducive to goal striving. And, the reasons for pursuing that were kind of twofold. First of all, the physiology stuff, I did feel like I was kind of getting to a spot of diminished returns where I was going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I was like, I think I'm interested in kind of a new research challenge or wrinkle, or delving into a new area, rather than just these really tiny incremental findings week over week and month over month. But also, there's no question at all, like categorically, the last 3 or 4 years have been by far the most challenging for me in terms of my own personal fitness. I'm in the worst shape I've ever been in, and it sucks. But that has pushed me to wrestle with a lot of topics in fitness that I otherwise would not have wrestled with. And I think, to be completely honest, fitness is something I always had a lot of aptitude for. And when I set a fitness-related goal, I was generally inclined to accomplish it. And it was not until the last 3 or 4 years that I actually ran into some pretty big challenges and some serious friction. And I had to actually kind of dig deep into like goal setting and motivation and behavior change, and had to wrestle with a lot of things I'd not ever had to deal. I was very charmed in my fitness journey up to that point. And so that's been something that's been very rewarding to kind of dive into these new areas of the research. I think it's produced some of the best writing I've ever done. And I also think that I'm not currently coaching clients at the moment, but the things I've learned in the last 3 or 4 years are going to, there's no question that I'm dramatically more equipped to coach people now than I was back then. And, specifically, it's kind of one of those, I've been dealing with an injury that the first time I got fed up with it and said, okay, I'm going to the doctor to sort this out, was 2017. And so it's just not getting any better. It's been like 7 years now. So I'm still actively trying to figure out what to do about that. I've got more medical appointments. I basically get to the point, I do medical appointments, I get fed up, I stop trying to pursue the next appointment, and it's just like, whatever, I'll hope it goes away. But I'm finally at the point, it's like, this is it. I'm going to keep going to the doctors until I'm just going to say, cut me open and just go in, see what you find, move some things around. What's the worst that could happen, right? So injury stuff was tough. Early COVID, being out of the gym for the first time and since I was 12, that really had me wrestling with a lot of questions about identity in terms of fitness, but also just like, there were ways I could train during COVID, and I legitimately didn't want to for the first time since I was 12. And I was like, why? Like, where did this come from? And I started to really dig into questions about like, well, why is training at a gym so much more enjoyable for me than, yanking on some resistance bands in my living room? What is it about training? And what is it about the gym environment? Like, it kind of, you can see how it got me going down this trajectory of looking into these questions of psychology and identity and goals and motivations and how to change behaviors when, because I never had to, from the time I was 12 to 28, I never had to say, okay, time to get in the gym. It was like, oh, great, I get to go to the gym. If anything, my biggest issue was that I would train too much on days where I should have been off, because, I'd be under recovered because I couldn't keep myself out of the gym. So yeah, the last 3 or 4 years have just been weird of dealing with all these questions I've never had to deal with before. And ultimately, I've come to find that when I'm not able to train the way I like to train, the way that I find to be fun and enjoyable, man, does it take the wind out of my sails and make me not really want to train anymore. And that's helped me develop a lot of empathy for for helping folks who might be in a similar situation. It's kind of changed how I approach that. And it's not just give them tough love and say, learn to like it. It's like, oh, we need to actually consider how we can approach this from a totally different angle to create an intersection of what you're trying to achieve and the things you enjoy doing, you know? And another thing is, you know, within the last couple of years, I, for the first time in my life, started taking a medication that influences appetite. And my appetite control was completely out of whack, you know? So some people might be wondering, oh, why are you writing all these mass articles the last few years about appetite? And it's like, well, because for the first time ever, I mean, it used to be that it came pretty naturally to me. I would know generally how my appetite responded to things and make some tweaks. Dieting was pretty easy. But man, you throw a new variable in the mix and kind of mess up that calibration and that titration of how your appetite is kind of intrinsically regulated. And all of a sudden, you got to lean on the literature hard to figure out how the heck are we going to manage this to kind of get back to what felt like a kind of normal steady state. So yeah, last 3 or 4 years have been, in terms of fitness for me, immensely challenging. But the really nice thing is that there's no question that that's made me a better coach. It's pushed me to expand into new areas of research. And overall, I think the impact on me as a person has been a massive net positive, because I'll get back in shape. You know, like I said, I'm going to tell them to cut me open like a fish down the middle and just dig in until they find something, you know, like just fix it. I'm tired of doing the really conservative tiptoeing around the, you know, this injury thing is just, it's been too long. So I'm not worried about getting back in shape. And so for that reason, I can look back and say, hey, this has been great. Like there's been a tremendous amount of growth that's occurred as a result of a lot of these challenges. And that sounds way overly dramatic. It makes it sound like I went through some tragic hardship. That's not the case. But sucking at fitness for a while, to put it in different terms, it really pushed me to a spot where I literally had to grow. I had to kind of adapt to that and figure out how to wrestle with a lot of challenges I'd never dealt with.
Trex, man. One, thank you for being so candid. Unfortunately, the podcast for me thinks like we're going to need a whole episode dedicated to I find that, but to be fair, man, I find often doing episodes with you, there's a lot of, like I said, different avenues one can go down. But I think you also managed to encapsulate in part other people's experiences like in the last few years for a wide variety of reasons, like why we approach the things that we do, why we do them in the first place, like lifting, but also just like, as you said, like personal life circumstances. I think that's one of the things that we bonded on, just like the idea that we both have had, you've had, I would say, like more serious, like injuries and setbacks in your time. I also think it's not a surprise you being an athlete, and I would classify you as such, like the wrestling, the experiences that you had, like playing football. There's a reason why, like I do think I'm going to go on a tangent here, man. But that's why shout out to my boy, Benjamin Franklin Escrow, where I know he's been public, like he spoke on our podcast about some of like his lower back issues or so on and so forth, where it's almost like there is, I think, a tiny bit of survivorship bias that occurs in the fitness space of people saying, not like, hey, guess what? Just walk it off, champ. Like, Trex, what are you experiencing, man? Like, it's your own psychological perception of what's going on. Like these pain signals, we know it's not necessarily indicative. Like, yes, the concept of being robust is very important to a lifter. There's also the raw reality of being like what I would classify as an athlete, meaning that you've moved your body in a wide variety of different ways for an extended period of time. There's also just the randomization of you pursuing different athletic endeavors and like what happens to the human body, right? Where there is an accumulation of things and there's not always like a one-to-one return to form. I give an example, shout out to my boy, like Lee, like actual athlete, he's my buddy Lee Biceps. Okay. Shout out to the Rascal Disco, very athletic person, like a sprinter, hockey player, multiple groin injuries, but he's also just more prone in general when it comes to lifting. He's had this shoulder injury, whereas like his tendons and ligaments, where like he'll be doing like, like a basic movement, and he's in fantastic shape. Like my man, he's a stud. But like he'll be doing like a tricep movement, and he'll just feel like a pull, like something will happen, and so he's more injury prone. But I do think there's a bit. This is like a complete tangent, Trex. when I say survivorship bias, where it's important to be robust, to not catastrophize things. There's also just like the raw reality of being a lifter, being a human, and like aging over time. Of something is catching up, some things not necessarily returning to normal. And to your point, man, when I can only imagine being someone where you've been competent in the space, where you set your mind doing something, and then you're able to do it, and to have like an inability, and someone who's like a natural problem solver, and you're aware of the research, you're aware, like, yeah, it's like, I'm sure like you've seen either like physiotherapists or this and that, like you've tried all the different avenues that one is supposed to, and has not produced that outcome. Like, one, how that produce a level of frustration. To your point, something that I identified with, and I think that's why it was very, very impactful what you said, because I think people could attach themselves to different aspects. We said, man, during COVID, or just in general, like maybe with some of the injuries, where you couldn't approach fitness the way that you wanted to, where you do have like a set definition of where perhaps you get more meaning and fulfillment. Like, I'd say for myself, like, I like the idea of feeling capable, right? Like, so, and I think my strength levels, or my ability to express myself maximally at a certain level, I like to explore what my top end is. And so, yeah, we can contextualize this and say, like, I'll just give you an example. Yeah, with my elbow, whatnot. Yeah, like, Omar, like, you can lift like 95% of what you normally do. Like, your best bench is 375. Like, you can bench 340 right now. That's good. Like in an absolute sense, you're still extremely capable. You're just not pushing that top end. I'm like, well, to me, the juice, the appeal is kind of in that top end. And I know there'll come a theoretical time where you no longer can hit a PR, but I don't like to have what I view as an artificial limitation imposed upon me, right? That not of my own choosing. So anyways, all that to say, man, the thank you, Trexler, for being very candid. And I like how you framed it. Hey, okay. The idea where the silver lining, where you said it has made you now into what you regard as being a better coach. It's made you a more empathetic person. It's giving you some of these experiences where I think all too often we hear the narratives, of course, of semi-charmed individuals where it's like, well, it worked for me. Like, why is it not working for you? And so I like the idea of like a very smart, very capable person such as yourself, just sharing aspects of yourself.
Yeah. It's and I'm not trying to do that thing of like, oh, there's always a silver lining. Like, I genuinely do believe like the avenues that I've been forced down from trying to navigate these different challenges have opened my eyes up to things that have made me better at what I do. I'm really happy where, even though my fitness output, my personal fitness over the last few years has been underwhelming to say the least, I think they've been the best productive years of my life in terms of the things I do, making content and doing research and things like that. So, you go along for the ride in life, and, that I'd say one of the most dangerous things about being someone who has gotten into shape before is that you maintain this potentially irrational confidence that you can do it again anytime you want. So, but yeah, I mean, I do think, once I get this injury thing sorted once and for all, and it's just super frustrating because it's a nerve injury that flares up when I have even like the tiniest bit of like essentially like intra-abdominal pressure, right? So it's like, I mean, if I were to bench press, it would cause an issue, let alone squat, deadlift, even incline benching can be a bit touchy. So anyway, all of that is to say, yeah, it's been a weird, wild ride the last few years, but I think that had I not run into all these totally unexpected challenges, because being candid, if you've been good at fitness from the ages of 12 to 28, you don't exactly expect that at 29, all of a sudden, you're going to feel like you have no control over your fitness levels, right? So that kind of caught me out of left field there, but it was unexpected. But I also I very much value and appreciate the ability to empathize with people who, for example, struggle with dieting. That was never something you could accuse me of in the first, 28 years of my life. If I wanted to gain weight, I did. If I wanted to lose weight, I did. But, having these experiences where you say, oh, so that's what it's like when your kind of neurophysiological appetite control is getting just a little bit decalibrated. Like you can kind of empathize with that in a way that you couldn't previously, even if you've seen it in the literature. So, yeah, it's something that really goes a long way when it comes to like experiencing the challenges of the people that you wish to help with your content creation or your coaching. And I think that that's genuinely just a really valuable thing. So I would encourage folks who, are like me when I was 27 and everything was always easy. When you are doing your coaching or making your content, maybe consider that. Think about, okay, what are the challenges that are probably very legitimate that I just haven't experienced yet? And I think it's a good way to minimize your likelihood of making an ass of yourself when you when you coach or make content. It can be a little bit of empathy can be a really powerful thing there.
No, I think the world in general just needs more empathy, but like the fitness space, 100%. Where like routinely you see like these folks like they're the sole arbiter of like what is right or like what is a measurable amount of like effort put forth or what one needs to do, and if only you were to follow exactly what they say, you'd achieve the results. And of course, if they were able to do it, why are you not able to do it? But I will say, Trex, man, there's a whole other episode inside this conversation, so I will save it. But I do want to thank you for that ending note and say, I want to get on as an example. I like to see people that have lived the whole experience, the peaks, the valleys. Shout out to our guy, Mike Tashir, recently as an example for his powerlifting meet, where I know he had like a pretty gnarly, consistent like back injury issues he was experiencing. He was away from competing for a while, and just recently he had one of his best meets of his entire life at the age of almost 40. And now I'm not trying to put forth like, here's another success story, Trex, of someone who went through the thing, but like I do like to see people that have accrued even more life experience. Many different things happen, their approach changes, and then they come back. I love to see it, and I have no doubt that that's why I want to talk in the future about your own fitness journey and how it's an ever evolving process. Yeah, I think it's just such an interesting conversation. And it's no surprise to me, I will say, that it's often, of course, the people that have dedicated so much of themselves into this pursuit, because guess what? You're super passionate about it. Like we're talking about the dude dropping that dime, okay, ATG low bar squats. They got to hold him back from the gym. It's not a surprise that like, not that some of these things happen, but I think, how do I phrase this? That we love lifting so much that sometimes there's unintended consequences, maybe down the road, that may or may not be as a result of lifting or just being a human. And it gives you, I'll just speak for myself, extra appreciation if you're ever able to return to some semblance of what you used to do. Like like seriously, Trex, we'll leave it here because I do think there's a whole other episode. I basically had to come to terms with the last several years of just a wide variety of different things, like parallel, like not what you experienced, but different things, with the elbow and so on and so forth. I had to accept like the death of future Omar. Like I may never hit a PR again. Like I accepted that, actually accepted that reality. It wasn't a giving up, like, oh, you're never going to apply yourself, but just like, hey, that might be a future. It's like, are you okay with that? And like, I am okay. And so anything that came after that now, so the silver lining, Trex, is rather than being so harsh on myself, where I wanted to like keep accelerating the process, like get back to like, come on, like you're just a few months away. That extra time, that extra perspective, and that acceptance, I think, changed my approach. That has allowed more recently for actual progress to be made again. Now, if it didn't happen, I would also be okay with it. And so it's a different feeling entirely. Like when I finally I hadn't hit a deadlift PR in like 6 or 7 years, man. When I hit it, I was elated, of course, but it wasn't that normal, like kind of triumphant. It was interesting to try to be a little bit more stoic, even in the moment when you achieve it, as like if I never would have achieved it again. So it's just more life experience, man.
Yeah, and I think a little bit of acceptance, a little bit of pragmatism, a little bit of stoicism, those all go a long way. We're all kind of along for the ride here, and you got to appreciate those highs when they come around, and make sure that they don't pass by without being recognized. But at the same time, you got to understand that life isn't just a linear series of PRs and achievements, and so if you tether too much of your happiness and fulfillment to those, then what are you going to do when they elude you? So. Yeah, we're all out here doing our best, man. And I think I love hearing about stories where people have, had to take some pretty big steps backward with their fitness and then get back to something that resembles their new best, whether that's better than their previous or not. That kind of stuff is always really impressive to me, because that's what's, I think, really indicative of, just a really high level of persistence and, resiliency and ingenuity of just like, I'm going to, do what's in my power to kind of find this new path and make it work. So that kind of stuff is really cool. And I think I'd like to believe, I choose to believe that that's what the next several years will look like for me in terms of my fitness stuff. So it's been fun to kind of put my own fitness on the back burner for a few years and focus more on writing and learning and doing research and things like that. But there will be another version of the jacked T-Rex. Not using the original formula jacked. I don't want to get any rumors going.
No.
I follow the law to a T.
Yep.
Banned substance list, all that stuff. But yeah, I don't think my beefy days are over yet.
Trex. T-Nation will rise again.
It's the comeback.
I'm ready for it, man. I'm super excited. I think that is the perfect way to end it. This has been a far-reaching episode. Like I said, I think there's a whole other episode, maybe like with Mike to share, like many other things, but like your journey, once again, it's ever-evolving process. I do think it was very important because we've had myself, like for hundreds of episodes, Helm like share his perspective, his journey, to hear a bit more of yours and like just your mindset and then the evolution of T-Rex. So man, I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to every single person who made it to the end of the podcast, who listened to this episode. You could go ahead and leave a rating and review. People typically will give 5 stars. We leave it up to your own discretion what you want to rate it. We're back every single insert date here from now until the end of time. We'll catch you in that next episode. Until next time.